Good, good. You'll encourage others to be brave.
So really quickly before we get started, can everyone hear me in the back? No? Okay.
Come up front.
I can project. I don't necessarily need a microphone, so I just wanted to ask before.
The sound is good down here.
Great. I like the acoustics. It's working for us. All right. Just a few more people coming in, and we'll go ahead and get started. All right. Okay, well, hello everyone. My name is Jennifer Levy. I am one of the board members for DAPS. So wanted to welcome you all and thank you guys for coming. This has been a great event so far. We've gotten some great feedback and really appreciate your attendance and participation. So I wanted to introduce you to Dr. Lawrence Schiller to my right. Dr. Schiller attended Pennsylvania State University and Jefferson Medical College of Philadelphia. He trained in gastroenterology at Southwestern Medical School and the Dallas VA Medical Center. Dr. Schiller has publications including subjects of gastric, physiology, intestinal transport, diarrheal diseases, and motility disorders. He was involved in patient care until his retirement in 2016 as a founding partner of Digestive Health Associates of Texas. Many of you have probably heard of them, which is one of the largest single specialty private gastroenterology practices in America. Since his retirement from direct patient care, he's continued to be involved in the education of medical students, residents, and fellows as clinical professor in the Department of Medical Education at Texas A&M University School of Medicine, Dallas campus. Dr. Schiller also served as program director of Gastroenterology Fellowship at Baylor University Medical Center for 24 years. Dr. Schiller has won 3 fellow teaching awards at UT Southwestern and Baylor, and the prestigious Ralph Thompsett Award for Excellence in Medical Education at Baylor. He served as president of the Texas Society for Gastroenterology and Endoscopy and president of the American College of Gastroenterology. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Schiller.
Thanks. Thank all of you for coming. I think this is a great activity, and answering your questions is going to be my goal for this hour. And I've been promised that we have a full hour if we need it. So before we get started with the lecture material, I just wanted to ask you what questions you had. Usually questions get left for the end, and that's not always the best time for them. So why don't you tell me what you're interested in learning today?
My husband is suffering from diarrhea one day, constipation the next day.
Okay, well, we can talk about that for sure. Yes, ma'am.
I wanted to know what you thought along those lines about the FODMAP diet.
Okay.
People with Parkinson's.
All right, I'll mention that. To give you a spoiler, that has no specific role in Parkinson's, but it is helpful for people with diarrhea. Yes, sir.
Just curious about what kind of impact diet has on Parkinson's.
Yeah, that's not been very well studied. And we'll touch on a few things where it comes up, but by and large, that's an area that needs to be explored more.
Which area? I didn't hear the question.
Oh, the question was about diet in Parkinson's disease. So we really don't know a whole lot, and I think you have to be a little skeptical about people who make big dietary claims. There are some things that are important, just in management issues, but as far as mitigating the disease, there's nothing that's known about that. Yes, ma'am. Yeah. Actually, the longest someone's taken Miralax has been about 45 years. We started doing it in the 80s, so it seems to be perfectly safe.
I read a lot about gut biome, keeping the healthy gut.
Absolutely.
To the brain issues. Are you going to touch about that?
We'll talk a little bit about that. Again, the final word isn't in on that, but there's a lot of interest in it. And as we'll talk about in just a couple minutes, people think maybe Parkinson's disease starts in your gut. It's really a gut disease, and the brain is affected secondarily. It's an interesting hypothesis. Yes, ma'am.
How do we prepare for a colonoscopy and have to fast and take our pills?
Yeah, well, the fasting is the least of the problems with the prep for a colonoscopy. The reason we get so excited about it is for the colonoscopy to have the most value, we have to be able to see things well. And so it has to be spick and span. And as you can imagine, it's not spick and span in everyday life. So you either have to drink a lot of fluid to wash things out or take a lot of pills that cause a lot of fluid to come in the gut to make that work. So there are lots of different things that people like to do for that. Most of them work pretty well. But it's really important to follow your doctor's directions if you're having a colonoscopy so you get the biggest effect. One of the problems when you have Parkinson's disease, as we'll talk about towards the end of the talk, is a lot of people get constipated. And that means let your gastroenterologist know if you are constipated, because they may have to do maybe a 2-day prep to make sure that everything's good when they go to take a look. Yes, ma'am. Well, that's another interesting thing. Yeah, the question is whether acid reflux plays a role in Parkinson's disease, and that's a fascinating question. And some people think that damage to the lining of the gut may enable the disease to get started in the preclinical time, a decade or two before people start to have the neurologic symptoms. Maybe that causes a problem, but that's still just hot investigation. Yes, ma'am. Yeah, people advocate for a lot of different diets, and the question is about diet again, whether the Mediterranean diet in particular is important for this. And there's very little known. It has not been studied well, so we can't give you a definitive answer for that. That diet is good for lots of other reasons, but right, well, that's a healthful diet for people in general. I mean, we all should go to Greece and live there, I guess. But it's, it's one of those things that hasn't been proved to have a specific effect in Parkinson's. So it's good to do that diet. I'm a big fan of olive oil, but don't do it with the idea it's going to make your Parkinson's better. It'll help your heart and other things that are important in your body, but maybe not the neurologic system. Yes, ma'am.
Dr. Schiller, I've got a microphone.
What's that? Oh,
I have a microphone.
An audience mic, okay.
I don't need one.
See, welcome Vanna White, everyone.
Have the next question? You did, perfect.
Aside from diet, does Parkinson's affect a person's weight?
Yes, it can indeed. Part of the gut problems can cause malabsorption, and you may not be able to absorb enough food to maintain your weight. So that can happen more in advanced disease. Plus, the movement disorder makes it hard to eat sometimes. Okay, one more question? Yes, ma'am.
Our earlier speaker said don't get too hung up about protein. Just interested in your thinking about the whole protein. Don't have it half an hour before, half an hour after.
Yeah, personally, I don't think it matters. I mean, you need to have enough protein, and for the average American adult, about 60 to 70 grams of protein a day is plenty. We often eat much more than that, and we end up peeing out the residues pretty much. So your body's very good at taking whatever you eat and doing what it needs to do with it. The question's always been whether some foods may aggravate symptoms in some ways. Proteins don't particularly aggravate GI symptoms by and large. Okay, well, yes, sir.
I think the question is, does protein inhibit the absorption of carbidopa, levodopa? That's...
Yeah, the issue of food and medicine interactions is important. And many times we'll talk a little bit later about how the stomach doesn't empty right in some people who have Parkinson's disease. If you have that and you eat food, that slows the emptying more. So the key thing, if you're adjusting your medicine, is to make sure you take the medicine in the same relation to the meal chronically. Otherwise, you may have days when you get a lot emptied into your intestine and days when you don't get much, and your level will fluctuate. And what you want to do in Parkinson's disease is keep a constant level, or as constant as possible.
Does taking that question one step further, maybe, is it the timing of when you eat your proteins? That's what I've been trying to do. So I'll eat the pill and then maybe wait a half an hour to an hour and then eat.
Yeah, I think that the thing is to be consistent. If you're consistent with your diet and consistent when you take your pills in relation to that, then you'll even out that variable. If you take a pill sometimes before your meal and sometimes 2 hours after a meal, you're going to get fluctuating levels. That's just the nature of emptying. All right, well, let's go ahead and deal with the official program. And again, we're informal today, so if you have questions as things come along, don't hesitate to ask. The worst I'll do is say we're going to cover that in a minute. So hang in there, and let's see, the little subtitle, Not Just a Brain Disease, Getting to the Guts of It. So if you could have the next slide. My clicker is episodic. So I'm sure you all have read a bit about Parkinson's disease as just, gee, what is that? It's hard these days to get a full explanation from your doctor. They're under great time pressure to see more patients. So I wanted to give you a little historical information, but it's interesting at a number of levels. Parkinson was born in 1755, and he died in 1824. He was the eldest of 3 children of a physician, but although he's made this big contribution to medicine with making this disease famous, he really wasn't a physician. He was an apothecary by training. And he studied at the London Hospital, and he was a diplomate of the Royal Society of Surgeons, and was sort of a general practitioner in Hoxton, which is a small town in England. He had many interests outside of anything related to medicine. So he was really interested in paleontology, fossils, and that book down in the lower right corner of the slide is a book he published about fossils and the ancient animals that lived in England. He was the leader of the Medical Society in London and was president of the Association of Apothecaries. Could have the next slide. Oh, well, just go back one a second. You'll notice that picture has an asterisk in, and that reason is that if you go on Google and do the image search, we have all this information out there, they'll show you a picture of James Parkinson, but that's the wrong James Parkinson. Okay? Parkinson died before photography was invented. And in fact, there are no images known to be him. He didn't have any paintings made. It's very curious. So be careful when you're looking at your computer. The information isn't always right. Okay, next slide. This is another picture of James Parkinson, but it's a different James Parkinson. And it's interesting because in Wikipedia, it's put right next to the front page of his book, where he described what came to be known as Parkinson's disease. He called it the shaking palsy, because the tremor is such a noticeable part of the illness. And he actually, in his report, talked about mentions of this disease going back to ancient times. This was not a new discovery. This has been in humans for years and centuries and millennia. It got named after Parkinson by a famous neurologist, Jean-Marie Charcot, who's a famous French neurologist. He has lots of diseases and conditions named after him. And that's actually a picture of the real Charcot. That's the real guy. So current concepts about Parkinson's, it's a neurodegenerative disease. And by that we mean that the nerves are dying off. You have billions of neurons in your body, trillions of neurons. And what ends up happening is that some of these die off. And what we've learned lately is why that happens in Parkinson's disease. So it seems to be related to loss of nerve cells in the substantia nigra, which is part of the brain. And that reduces dopamine release in the basal ganglia of the brain, central structures, and that induces the movement disorder. And for the last 20, 25 years, that's been the explanation of it. And it sounds good, and it's probably right, But all that was based on more advanced cases, because Parkinson's disease has a very long time course. Before you get to the point of someone making that diagnosis, you've probably had the beginnings of the disease for 10 or 15 years minimum. So it goes for a long time before it produces problems. It's mainly a numbers game. If you knock out a certain number of these neurons, then you start to develop symptoms, and they get worse as you lose more neurons. It's not an on and off, all or none phenomenon. It's a gradual decline of these neurons. And the latest research is fascinating because it seems to be a disease that's related to the misfolding of proteins in the nerves. You know, nerves are very impressive structures. There's a nerve body, there are dendrites, which are little extensions that go out of the body that pick up signals. There's an axon, one generally long projection that carries the signal out of the neuron to the next cell in line. And so that's a very complex structure. And one of the proteins is this alpha-synuclein, which is a protein that, like every protein in our body, has a three-dimensional structure. You know, we think of the genetic code as being a linear code, and every three bases on the DNA indicate an amino acid to go into a molecule, and people get mutations and all those things based on that. But when the protein is made, it's made as a chain of amino acids, but then that folds on itself and has preferred structures. And if it's misfolded, it doesn't function right. And what seems to be the problem with this is that this particular protein misfolds and sort of clogs up the nerve so that it eventually has a metabolic failure and dies. So that's a real interesting phenomenon. Why it misfolds is not exactly known just yet. And that's where a lot of research is going to try and understand how that folding process goes awry. We know in some diseases, you know, when people were cannibals, there was this disease called kuru. And if you ate somebody's brain and ate a misfolded protein called a prion, it would cause your proteins to get misfolded. And that was a fascinating discovery. Fortunately, a rare disease. There are not many cannibals left in the world. But that disease and a bunch of diseases like that are related to protein misfolding. And it turns out Parkinson's disease probably also, in many of the cases, is related to that misfolding of a protein. And what happens when the protein misfolds, it clumps up and forms these things called Lewy bodies, which again sort of clog up the metabolic machinery in the nerve cell. So let's have the next slide, please. There we go. So one thing to remember is that our nervous system is complicated. We always focus on the brain and the spinal cord, the central nervous system, because that's the biggest repository of neurons, has very obvious effects. You get a stroke, you can't move one side of your body. You have problems with brain tumor. You get into difficulties with headaches, whatever. That's the nervous system that we focus the most attention on. But there is a whole other nervous system in the periphery of the body. And these are nerves that regulate all the other functions in the body, and they talk to the brain, but a lot of the decision-making, if you will, is made locally. So in the gut, we have a little brain. It doesn't have as many neurons. Instead of 86 billion neurons in the brain, it has only 600 million neurons. But it has a complete nervous system. You have sensory nerves, you have interneurons, you have motor nerves that make the gut do things. And much of what's happening in your gut is due to that local system working and doing reflexes. So we don't think of that as getting to the point of consciousness. It's not that complex of a system. And it's been very well described over the last 100 years. We know pretty much the identity of each nerve cell, how it's hooked up, what transmitters it uses, and what have you, and how it works in everyday physiology to regulate things like swallowing and stomach emptying and peristalsis in the small intestine and bowel movements in the colon. All that's organized by the enteric nervous system. And what we're starting to learn is that that enteric nervous system, just like the big brain, may be damaged in Parkinson's disease. And that may cause a lot of dysfunction in the gut. We don't understand it with the same precision that we do for how the brain and movement disorder fit together, but we're starting to understand this a whole lot better. And what's obvious now, looking at this field, is that there are lots of gut problems that people with Parkinson's disease get, whether they're directly related to the nerve degeneration in the enteric nervous system, or they're related to the medicines we use to treat the Parkinson's or other problems that come in. For instance, people with really advanced disease can't move around very well. And so it's maybe not surprising that people get constipated, because constipation depends a lot on signaling that your colon gets from moving around and bouncing around in your belly. So there are all sorts of connections that happen in the small brain, and the interesting thing is that it's attached to the big brain, but there's much less direct action of the big brain on the gut. So for instance, the vagus nerve, which is the main nerve that connects the brainstem to the gut, 90% of the nerve fibers in there are sensory nerves going back up to the brain. Only 10% are nerves saying do this or do that. So it's a very interesting system. There's talk back and forth, and there's a route through nerves like the vagus nerve for things to go that happen in the gut to get back up to the brain. And there's a lot of interest now in all sorts of strange things that you wouldn't think. For instance, people get depressed. Some people now get vagal nerve stimulators because the vagus enters the brainstem and has functions that are spread throughout the brain, and that seems to help those people. So there's a whole interesting new field being developed as time goes by. Now, this was an article just last month in the Washington Post that some of you may have seen. I think it got recopied in the morning news here. But this was really interesting, and it reported on a scientific article that was published that, if you can read the thing, researchers found that people with upper GI conditions were far more likely to develop Parkinson's disease later in life. And that includes the reflux kind of issues that people are talking about. And the concept is that maybe damage to the lining of the intestine allows something to get in, whether it be a germ or an aberrant protein, to get taken up to the brain and trigger some of the problems that occur there. Again, this is hypothesis right now. It's certainly not a proven thing, but it's a fascinating hypothesis. And these diseases in the gut are much more common than they used to be. You know, people didn't complain as much about reflux and dyspepsia and indigestion in the old days as they do now, probably for lots of reasons. And Parkinson's disease also is more common now than it used to be back in the old days. So interesting connection. Again, the final word is yet to be relayed to us. We have the next slide, please. So the pathologists can look at nerve tissues and see evidence for those Lewy bodies, the clumped up protein. And if you look at people who have Parkinson's disease and end up having an autopsy after they pass away, 2/3 of them have changes in the enteric nervous system, the nerves in the gut, that include Lewy bodies. So that's the same pathology that's happening in the brain and could be responsible for some of the symptoms we see in the gut. One of the things that, again, is interesting and not well examined, because we don't ordinarily biopsy people's guts with a real deep biopsy to get where the nervous system is that the changes in the enteric system may predate the changes in the brain. So again, the gut is a big area in which we interact with the environment. You know, if you took your intestine and ironed it out flat, it would be the area of a tennis court. And that's folded up in everybody. And anything you eat or ingest or happen to swallow, you know, some dust in the air that gets in your nose and you swallow some mucus in, that all gets exposed to your body. That's part of the reason why the gut has the biggest part of the immune system in the body. It's a huge area of exposure to outside things. So the idea is that, well, maybe problems in the gut develop, they're exposed to something in the environment that triggers these Lewy bodies, that in turn ends up getting up into the brain and causing a problem. Interesting theory, but we don't have all the evidence needed for that. And the changes are more common in the top part of the gut, the stomach and the small intestine, rather than in the colon. And people who have damage to the mucosa, like I mentioned from that Washington Post article, may be more likely to have this problem develop in their gut first. But again, we need a lot more studies before we can say, yeah, that's how this all happens. But it's a very interesting theory. All right, next slide. So what are some of the GI symptoms that people with Parkinson's disease complain about? And you'll see that these are symptoms that everybody complains about at some point or another. It's just that if you have Parkinson's disease, you're more likely to have some of these GI problems than the average person who doesn't have Parkinson's disease. So we'll talk about each of these in turn. They include oropharyngeal dysphagia, trouble initiating a swallow, getting food down into the esophagus, problems in the esophagus itself, moving the food down to the stomach, problems with emptying of the stomach so that food just hangs out in the stomach rather than being passed downstream, difficulties in the small intestine where instead of the nice peristalsis that pushes the food through, it gets disordered. And there may be delay in that area. And that can predispose you to get bacterial overgrowth and have problems with digesting your food and end up losing weight because of that. And then constipation, where the motility of the colon is irregular, and that causes problem with evacuation. So let's go through these. More is known about some than others, and we'll try and tell you what's known about these problems. So swallowing is one of the main things that's involved with this. And the reason is that swallowing is just like walking or moving or doing bench presses. It involves skeletal muscle. And all that muscle has nerves telling it exactly what to do. This muscle in your throat and in the upper couple inches of your esophagus is skeletal muscle, just like in your arms and legs. And just like you can have problems with moving the muscles in your arms and legs, you can have problems in moving these muscles in a coordinated fashion. And that causes difficulties with swallowing because that's a very complex and coordinated action of your body. And the reason it has to be that way is one of the design defects we have is that our airway crosses our foodway in our throat. The air is supposed to go through your nose and back down into your lungs and the larynx and the trachea. And the food goes in your mouth and goes through your pharynx and goes down into the upper esophagus. But those two things cross over, and if you're swallowing something and the coordination is not good, stuff can go down the wrong pipe. And you can aspirate, and that's a bad thing because it predisposes you to get pneumonia and have problems along those lines. So it's a design flaw, but our body takes care of that by having a very precise way of managing swallowing. So in your brainstem, the lower part of your brainstem, you have a series of nerves, and they're in pairs because there are muscles on each side of your pharynx, and they're all lined up, and it's click, 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 click. They fire off in turn, and that makes the muscles in your throat fire off in turn and go down. Now, if you have a problem with Parkinson's disease, that coordination may be lost. You may have difficulties with getting that nice orderly flow. And one of the main groups that we send our patients with Parkinson's disease to are the speech and language therapists who are experts in this area and can help us with trying to get swallowing working better and also the difficulty people have with what's called dysarthria, trouble speaking. Because again, talking, you're moving the muscles in your voice box to make the sounds that we use for speech. So this area gets impaired frequently in people who have Parkinson's disease. Now, the nerves initiate and coordinate this function, and these are somatic nerves, just like the nerves that work your arms and legs, and it's split second, hundredths of a second, for each of the muscles to do their job and pass on the food bolus to the next group of muscles. The autonomic nerves, the vagus nerve, coordinates the smooth muscle contraction down in your esophagus and makes that timely, because when you're taking things into your body, it's not only pushing them in, but you have to have relaxation ahead so that it has a place to go. Otherwise, it gets stuck and confused, and that can be a problem too. And when it comes to swallowing, it's mainly the skeletal muscle, this oropharyngeal phase, that gets disturbed. Okay, next slide. And again, it's common if you look at studies of this, and people pay a lot of attention to this, about 82% of people with Parkinson's disease, now that's all stages, when you just had the diagnosis made and when you're, in a bad way towards the end, 82% have problems with dysphagia, at least sometimes. So this is an important issue that you need to make your doctors aware of if it's bothering you. You find food going down the wrong pipe, having a hard time getting food down, that's real important to report, because again, in collaboration with the speech and language therapist, we can help you with that and make it a little easier to get down. So that's an important thing to mention. Only 20 to 40% of people are aware of it. So if you screened a bunch of people and looked at their swallowing with x-rays or what have you, there are a lot more people who have problems there who just don't realize it yet. So if you start to have difficulties with that, let your doctor know. Again, this is associated with the typical Lewy body pathology, and the main complication is you don't clear your pharynx effectively, you aspirate stuff into your lungs, you get pneumonia, and that makes things a whole lot worse. When this gets really bad, people have trouble with drooling, and sometimes we have to use medicine to cut down the amount of saliva you make so that it's not objectionable for people. But weight loss can come from not being able to swallow the food. People will, give up trying after a while, and it may not be before they've taken enough calories to maintain themselves. Next slide. So how do we take care of this? Well, we have lots of tests we can do to look at this. This has been very well studied. It turns out you can just give someone a questionnaire and get a pretty good idea if they have a problem with dysphagia or not. And if you ask specific questions, it's not that hard to pick up the people who have difficulties. You can do an x-ray. You can swallow a little bit of barium and see how it moves through the throat. There are endoscopic techniques where you can look in the back of the throat. Usually you put a very tiny endoscope through the nose and look down in the pharynx as someone's trying to swallow things and see if they're coordinating things correctly. And then motility studies where you put a little catheter down there and measure the pressures that are generated. So those are not the world's best studies, but they're not terrible studies to go through, and they only last a short time if you have to do them. So it's important to know what's going on down there. So again, if you have symptoms, let your doctor know. The therapy, the speech and language therapists are rock on this, and they use physical techniques. Sometimes just tucking your chin down while you're swallowing makes a big difference in your ability to get the food down. And they have ways of modifying food. They use food thickeners to make the food a little more viscous so it can be handled by the muscles better. Drugs, levodopa actually helps this some. So again, if that's a manifestation you're having, you may want to talk to your doctor about adjusting your dose of medicine. And optimizing that level of levodopa is really important if someone has trouble swallowing. Drooling, we give medicines to dry up the saliva And sometimes people even use Botox, and if there's a little left over, they can catch a few wrinkles for you. Deep brain stimulation, I know you have a little booklet in your bag about deep brain stimulation. That's a hot new therapy, and that may help. It hasn't been well studied as a way of fixing dysphagia, but people are hopeful that that will indeed be the case in time. Okay, esophageal motility studies. The esophagus is a very simple organ. On the outside, it goes from here to here. It's about a foot long. It's not a giant organ. It's a muscular tube. And what happens is when food enters the upper esophagus, there's a wave of contraction that pushes it down towards the stomach. And that sounds real simple, but nature made it really complicated. The upper part of the esophagus is skeletal muscle. The lower part is smooth muscle, the kind of muscle in the rest of your intestine. The control of the upper esophagus and the sphincter muscle up there that keeps it shut ordinarily is from nerves from your brainstem. The lower esophagus is worked by the enteric nervous system that's in the wall of the esophagus. And what the vagus nerve does is like firing a starter pistol in a race. It says, we're swallowing now, and then each level of the esophagus has a delay period that's characteristic of that level. So a slow delay up front, more of a delay down below, and so you get this wave of contraction that goes through the esophagus and pushes the food down to the stomach. The lower esophageal sphincter is a smooth muscle sphincter. It relaxes when the food is first swallowed so that the material can drop into the stomach. So it's a pretty straightforward thing. We can evaluate this with x-rays or manometry tests, a little catheter-based study. And if you look at a group of people who have Parkinson's disease, peristalsis tends to be a little bit on the weak side in general. How much of a problem that is, it varies. Some people get spasms where they get episodic spasming of the esophagus, and that makes it hard to swallow too. It's different than the oropharyngeal dysphagia we were just talking about, but relatively simple organ, but one that gets affected by Parkinson's too. Now, the stomach's the next organ down the line, and we call delayed stomach emptying gastroparesis. It's a great Greek word, paralysis of the stomach. And the word is better than our understanding of the disorder because it turns out that there are lots of people who have trouble in the upper gut, sort of indigestion, fullness, difficulties, and it also turns out it doesn't matter a whole lot whether you're emptying is slow or not when those things are happening. We used to think slow emptying was the big thing, and we were looking for medicines for decades that would speed it up, but it turns out those medicines don't work all that well, and the people who don't have slow emptying have the same sort of identical problems as those that do. So people with functional dyspepsia or gastroparesis can have all sorts of problems. And the stomach is a really neat organ with amazing physiology too. The upper part of the stomach, when you eat a meal, actually relaxes. And it has to relax so the food has a place to go. And it's neat that it does because that lets us eat a whole big food. You can eat 1,500 calories in 5 minutes because that can all be accommodated in your upper stomach if it relaxes properly. After the meal is consumed, the emptying of liquids from the stomach is controlled by the pressure difference between the stomach and the duodenum, the small intestine beyond that. So later on, after you eat, the upper part starts to contract and increase the pressure in the stomach to push the liquid out. Now, solids have to be ground up before they can leave the stomach. So if you eat a steak or a tomato or something like that, it has to be smashed up to be less than 1 millimeter in size before it can escape the stomach. And that's due to very strong peristalsis in the antrum, the lower part of the stomach, that sort of funnel-shaped part. And the peristaltic waves get increasingly strong as it goes down and basically crushes the food. The pylorus, the emptying, the sphincter that controls the emptying in the stomach at the end, stays shut, and the food goes up against it and gets put back until it's small enough to get through the pylorus when it's open. And so it too is a complicated thing. It's all regulated by the nerves in the stomach. And the stomach actually has a pacemaker and is electrically operated, just like your heart is, in terms of these contractions. So you have a wave of contractions that goes down the stomach and pushes the food down and grinds it up. And when it's small enough, the particles can escape through the pylorus and the other particles are kept in. Things that you eat that you can't grind up just stay in your stomach. They're never emptied out during the mealtime. And then afterwards, when you're fasting, that gets pushed through. So like when you eat corn and you have a little corn husk in there, they hang out in the stomach because they can't be ground up. They're too tough. And when you're all empty of all the nutrients in the meal, then there's a special wave of contraction. The pylorus is inhibited, and everything gets swept out of the stomach and then all the way down your small intestine to the colon. And then the next day you see the corn as it comes out of you. So it's really an amazing structure. Again, way more complex than a human might design it. But it generally works pretty well in most people, except when it doesn't. And there are people who have problems with emptying their stomach, and as you can imagine, they end up getting problems with nausea and vomiting and postprandial fullness. And that can be a big issue. Now, if you look at emptying tests where you measure how fast a marker leaves the stomach, almost everybody with Parkinson's disease has impaired emptying. But not everybody has symptoms with it. The other thing you need to know is that the levodopa, that is the backbone of treatment for Parkinson's disease, will slow gastric emptying. And that can be another feature that we see in people who are on levodopa to get it in their brain to help with the movement disorder. But the dopa has effects elsewhere in the body. In the gut, it tends to relax things. So again, let your doctor know if you're having trouble with upper GI symptoms, fullness, nausea, that sort of thing, because they may need to adjust your dose of medicine one way or another, or change how you take it in relation to the meal. So those are important things to keep in mind. Okay, so symptoms of gastroparesis: you have nausea, vomiting, early satiety, means you feel full faster than usual, and postprandial fullness, where it's like, oh, can't believe I ate the whole thing. Consequences: intake goes down, and again, this can be a cause for weight loss. If you don't eat the food, you can't use it to maintain your body. And some people even get a little dehydrated if this is a problem, particularly if you're vomiting. So again, if you're getting those symptoms, let your doctor know. And irregular emptying, as we talked about before, can alter the emptying of the drug. So you want to try and keep everything synchronized. Since your body tends to synchronize around eating, the key thing to do is to make sure you take your medicine in the same relation to eating that you do day after day. Then the doctor can adjust the dose appropriate to whatever your emptying is like. Treatment: there was a great drug that we had for a few years called domperidone, and that is a dopa blocker, but just in the periphery. So if you took that, it didn't affect the dopa in your brain, but when the dopa was affecting the muscle in your stomach or your colon, it would block its effect there. So you wouldn't have the medicine effect on top of whatever neurologic problem you had in those areas. And unfortunately, that medicine never got approved in the US. It was sold in Europe and elsewhere in the world for nausea, because it's a good anti-nausea medicine. And then there were reports of people having heart irregularities with it. And so we used to have people go down to Mexico and get it and live happily ever after, but that's been cut off because the FDA said, no, never use this. This is too dangerous. So it's still out there in the periphery, but again, it takes a brave person to take it these days because of all the warnings about it. Okay, the small bowel is the next part of the gut, and as I mentioned earlier, the small bowel has peristalsis that moves things through, and it's a very interesting organ too. all your food gets absorbed in the small intestine, and it gets sort of mixed with the digestive juices that you make in your pancreas and in your liver, in the bile, and that helps it to get digested, and then the individual molecules get absorbed, and you feel good, and you're able to do things and have energy and all the good things with that. And then eventually it ends up going down, leading the remaining fluid into the colon. It's also where most of the fluid that you absorb gets absorbed. So normally we eat and drink a liter or two, a quarter or two of material each day, and to that is added 8 or 9 liters of digestive juices, stomach juice, bile, pancreatic juice, that help to digest the food. And then almost all of that is reabsorbed by the time it gets to the small intestine. You only have about a quart of material that gets into the colon each day. So the small intestine really does an important job there. Now, if the motility in the small intestine, that peristalsis, is disturbed, then bacteria can start to overgrow in the small intestine. And that will interfere with digestion and will cause malabsorption of things, sometimes diarrhea with that, sometimes sort of irritable bowel kind of symptoms of bloating and whatever. And that can be a big problem. And for people who have irritable bowel syndrome, we use that FODMAPs diet that was mentioned earlier, because FODMAPs are sugars and sugar alcohols that we eat that are relatively poorly absorbed. And if you happen to have a lot of these sugars down there, they'll get fermented by bacteria. If you have bacteria overgrowing in your small intestine, even the normal sugar can get fermented there and cause problems. So those people get gas and have issues with diarrhea and weight loss as a result of that. Yes, sir, you had a question? Yeah. Well, probiotics are interesting. I mean, people swear by them and they swear at them. The difficulty is that they're not regulated like drugs are. They're regulated like food is. And so the probiotic that you buy at the drugstore may have been on the shelf for 6 months, may not have a living bacteria in the bottle. And so it's very irregular as to what you're actually getting. And there's no way of knowing a priori what's a good bacteria and what's a bad bacteria. We know the bad bacteria is they make people sick. You get cholera or something like that. That's a bad bacteria. But it's hard to tell what the good bacteria are. And we now have very fancy tests to detect the different bacteria by their DNA characteristics. And so people are starting to understand this a little bit better. But we still don't have that basic understanding of what's good and what's bad. We have things that people have done for hundreds of years that they think are good. So all the fermented foods, yogurts, things like that, we think they're good bacteria. And there's some studies that suggest, yes, that does help some people with symptoms. But there's not a whole lot of science in the sense of this is what a good bacteria is, this is how it makes your health better, and this is how to use it. With all those steps haven't been filled in yet. I think eventually they will be. There's great interest in it, but it's a difficult issue for people to deal with. Personally, I was always happy to have patients try them out. There were a few brands that seemed to be more consistent than others, and sometimes people say, "Oh, I feel much better for that." But yeah, no, all that fermented. I mean, is a whole industry built on that idea, and I think there's a nugget of truth in it, at least for some people, but it's not a panacea for everyone, unfortunately. Okay, so small bowel dysmotility, again, vague symptoms, sort of like IBS symptoms. It hasn't been accurately recorded in Parkinson's disease as to how many people have those kind of problems or if that needs to be managed any differently. So we just do the symptomatic management we do for IBS, including things like a low FODMAP diet and trying some of the medicines we have available. Okay, next we're down to the colon. So we're almost done for those of you who are getting bored. Constipation. Okay, that's a big problem. in the whole U.S., who wants to guess how many people in the U.S. have constipation? At least 1 week a year. Well, it's not 100, it's about 30% if you do surveys. So still a bigger number than you would think. But it's a very common problem in the general population, and it probably is more common in people with Parkinson's disease. And the number that shows up in most of the reports, about 80%. So it's likely to happen. And again, the idea of, well, maybe if you're a healthy person who doesn't have Parkinson's disease and you're constipated, the constipation may lead to you getting Parkinson's disease. That's a current thought that's going around. And it may be true. We don't know. If you look at statistical kind of studies, there's a grain of truth to that. So it's interesting. Constipation often happens early in people with Parkinson's disease, maybe even before the tremor gets established or some of the other symptoms are regular. And the worse your constipation is, it's likely the worse your Parkinson's is. So that's really interesting. Now, the thing to remember when you're talking about this with your doctor is constipation is not just infrequency. People have all sorts of different definitions of it. Some patients, if they haven't had a stool today, they're constipated. But generally we think, chronic constipation, you have to have fewer than 3 stools a week for, more than a few months. So that's something that happens, fairly frequently in the general population. Probably has to do with our diet and activity levels and lots of other things. But it's important to recognize that that's not the main symptom of constipation. Only 1/3 of people with constipation have infrequency by that definition. For most people, constipation means difficulty getting the stool out. Okay, so there's straining. That's 80% of people with constipation have straining. People have difficulty feeling like they've had an incomplete evacuation. They haven't gotten everything out. They have difficulties that require them to use their fingers to manipulate their bottoms to help the stool out. Those things are actually all more common than infrequency. So if you're having difficulties down there, again, let your doctor know there are things to do for that. And someone mentioned Miralax earlier. That's polyethylene glycol. That's a artificial substance that you take in. It's interesting scientifically. We did a whole lot of work on it 40 years ago to figure out how it worked and all. But it basically works by holding water inside the intestine. So it makes the stool softer and you have more material getting down to the rectum and more need to go. It works for many people, not everybody though. So sometimes we have to use other laxative-type medicines. That works well. We have medicines that stimulate motility in the colon. They work okay in some people, though they tend to be a whole lot more expensive than the other things. The main thing you want to do if you find yourself in constipation is to think about your diet. What are you eating? Are you eating enough fiber? But you want to avoid eating too much fiber, because if you have a whole lot of fiber, it'll just make things worse for many of these people. Also, some people, about 1/3 of people with constipation, have problems with the muscles opening up in the pelvis to let the stool out. And that's a problem we can help with physical therapy. So again, your doctor will need to assess that problem with a digital examination where they put your finger in your bottom and ask you to squeeze and try and pretend to have a bowel movement and see how those muscles are working. Because if that's defective, we can use biofeedback techniques to fix that. So again, a complicated area for us, and something that's common in people who have Parkinson's disease. This is a little diagram of what your pelvis looks like if I was to cut you right down the midline. In the back there where it says coccyx, that's the bottom of your spinal column. The coccyx, the little tailbone. And then in front is the symphysis pubis. That's the hard bone that runs across the base of your belly. And it forms a big bowl. And the bottom of that bowl is shut off by muscles to keep your insides from falling out when you stand up. And that pelvic floor can have disturbed function. And it frequently happens. I mean, if you're a woman and you've had a baby or two, that baby has to make a hole big enough for it to come out in your pelvic floor. And so it smashes the muscle up and the nerves on top of it. And often that muscle doesn't work right after that. And that can be a big problem, either with being too weak, so you have leakage issues, or too tight and scarred up, so you can't evacuate properly. But normally what happens is there's a loop of muscle that runs from the front around the back of your rectum, the puborectalis muscle. That pulls it forward, and you have basically a right angle between your rectum and the axis of the anal canal. So if you were a stool trying to come out, you'd have a hard time getting around that corner. It's like trying to get a tractor trailer truck into an alley behind somebody's house. There's just not enough room to make the corner. So what the body does is it relaxes that puborectalis muscle, and then that straightens out the axis of the rectum and the anal canal so the stool can come out. Yeah. So how do we assess constipation? Well, we can measure how fast things go through your colon. We can do anorectal manometry, where we measure the strength of the muscles in your anal canal. We can do a test called defecography, where we use x-rays to make that picture I just showed you. And then therapy, the standard therapies we use for everybody are what gets used for people with Parkinson's disease. Enemas can be quite helpful. Fiber supplements, again, more is not better once you get to 20 or 25 grams of fiber a day. Yes, sir. Metamucil is a fiber supplement. Yeah, you can. There's no harm in that. But again, taking 6 scoops of that isn't going to be better than taking 2 scoops. Yeah, use it within reason. We have prokinetic drugs, and the latest thing has been a vibrating capsule, a little pill size like a vitamin pill that vibrates. And it's really crazy, but someone invented this, and it works, and they got it approved. And you take one of these pills, and you have a little remote control, and you can make it buzz, and it buzzes the stool out. It's sort of like when you're on a trip on a potholed road. You sometimes have to go to the bathroom after that. Yeah. No, you take one. You take one each day, and you poop it out. I mean, it's the economics of it are not great, but it's out there. You may encounter it. So to sum up and close, Parkinson's disease is associated with lots of different GI symptoms. Dysphagia is common, trouble swallowing, nausea or vomiting, bloating and distension, constipation. The symptoms may be related to the underlying neurologic disease because it may affect the nerves in the gut. It may be related to the medicines we use to treat the neurologic disease. And the important thing is the symptoms usually can be managed, and if they are managed, it makes your life better. And I know the theme is making your life better for this conference, and certainly if you're having these symptoms, tell your doctor about them, because chances are they can make your life better when it comes to that. Well, thanks very much for your attention. We're sort of at the end of our time, but I think we can take a few minutes for questions if there are any other questions out there. You're welcome. Yes, ma'am.